Welcome to Building Better Cities, the podcast where we explore the evolving landscape of urban development and the critical role that infrastructure and real estate investments play in shaping our communities. I'm your host, Kate Gasparo, and in today's first episode, we'll be diving into new research that shows the relationship between the built environment and human behavior. To unpack these topics, I spoke with Andrew Sonta, a professor of sustainable civil engineering at EPFL, where he directs the Ethos Lab. Andrew's work from his time at Stanford, Columbia, and EPFL has been cited hundreds of times, and he continues to be a leader in sustainable engineering. In our conversation, we explored Andrew's most recent published work about the urban form and its impact on social cohesion, and how that can help us build better cities. So, when you got to EPFL, did you start Ethos or did you inherit Ethos?
No, I started it within, I think, at EPFL and ETH, the way it kind of works is professors, when they're hired, they create a lab. I mean, it's not so dissimilar from what we're used to at Stanford. But I had to come up with a name for it. And I spent longer than I cared to admit trying to come up with the
Okay, well,
name
the
for
name
the
is very cool,
lab.
so I definitely think it was worth it.
Thank you. Yeah. So ethos, it's quite broad, engineering and technology for human oriented sustainability. But yeah, the idea was to kind of have the human, the social, the human piece represented in kind of the branding for the group. Because what we're interested in is looking at the built environment and sustainability, but kind of, certainly explicitly tried to study the humans and the people that use the spaces that we build. So that was kind of the reason for
And
ethos.
when you got hired, was it under the premise that you would build something along the lines of human-oriented sustainability, or did you get the freedom to specialize more on that side of the built environment?
I think the call for this position was sustainable civil engineering. So they wanted someone to kind of strengthen sustainability efforts, which has definitely been a big goal for EPFL, like broadly speaking. So the short answer is there was the freedom to do that. And I think when I was at Stanford working on my PhD, I think I was initially just interested in environmental sustainability in the built
Yeah.
environment. That was kind of the driver for me. And then when I was working on my first research projects, it's when I started to realize the users of buildings and of neighborhoods are super important to this whole piece. And if we want to make progress on sustainability, we also have to consider the people themselves. And we don't have a lot of, from an engineering perspective, we don't have a lot of good tools for like explicitly studying
Yeah.
people's experience in the context of sustainability. So it was a slow evolution to realize like, oh, maybe that's kind of the contribution that we can make is in this way. We tend, I think, to take a pretty broad perspective when it comes to like defining research questions.
Yeah.
I would say the explicit studying of the users of the built environment in the context of how the built environment is performing. So performance can be about, for example, the energy efficiency or the environmental indicators associated with the built space. Can also be about, the social performance. So is the office building a collaborative space? Is the neighborhood walkable? These are kind of the human oriented sides of things. We want to make sure that the users, the people are explicitly studied. The other thing that ties it together and narrows the scope of work a little bit is we are engineers and also really kind of data driven people as well. So we think that one of the ways that we can create this new understanding at this intersection of social, human, and environmental is through the data opportunities that are becoming more and
Yeah.
more available. So sensors in buildings or from mobility data or random open data that cities provide, that can be a really powerful tool potentially. So that's what we're excited to look into.
Because you talked about walkability, and then in reading the article you sent to me, which was awesome. Like I like dove into it. I wanted to look at all the resources that you were referencing. There's that Baltimore index that you used as a counterpart for the social cohesion of an urban area.
Mhm. Hmm.
Are there other types of these indicators or like maybe not criterion, but like rating systems that you're finding through this research that you're interested in? And what do those look like?
This social cohesion is something that I think is really interesting and important. Like when we talk about the social indicators or social performance or the human, like what metrics can we use to assess whether a built environment is performing well for the users? I
Yeah.
think there are lots of things you can look at. You could look at health, you could look at people's happiness, their
Hmm.
self-reported experience, whether they find it an inspiring place. You can look at lots of different things.
Yeah.
I think the reason that I was thinking about social cohesion in that paper and just kind of social capital in general, like the social resources that exist, is because I think that the built environment and the way that it's designed can have a big impact on the way that we interact with others.
Hmm.
And this is something that I've thought about both within buildings. So, like in an office building, one of the reasons that we go to office buildings is to interact with our colleagues, to collaborate with them, to like have that random conversation at the water cooler that's inspiring, right? Like that. I think that that's a really important goal for that type of building. And similarly, like on the urban scale,
Yeah.
there's a lot of theory that suggests that the more walkable a place is, the more we actually interact with our neighbors, and that can help us form tighter social networks and potentially increase social cohesion. So, for that study, I was thinking about this in architecture and urban planning. People have written about this as a potential benefit of walkable spaces. But what I really wanted to do was to try and find some data to do analysis to see if we saw any relationship between the way that the neighborhood was designed and these social outcomes that could be important and also affected by the design of the built environment. So that data set was like one of the few open data sets I could find that had both social cohesion survey results, questions that were designed to measure social cohesion, and also a geographic reference where this person actually lives, not their specific address, but which neighborhood they live in. In that way, you can actually tie the survey measure to a specific location. With that specific location, you can use other data to assess how walkable that place is and what are the different aspects of walkability and how they're measured.
Yeah. And in the paper, you are summarizing social cohesion sort of as the trust that individuals put in their neighbors. Or how well you know your neighbors, if you can count on them. Do you
Yeah,
find that you experience social cohesion in that way, or are there other ways to experience social cohesion?
yeah, so there it's 4 or 5 questions that are used. Those questions were designed by a professor to best measure social cohesion or self-reported social
Sure.
cohesion. But the cool thing about research is that there are a lot of people who, like, have focused specifically on that exact topic, right? And have spent time thinking about what's the best way to measure social cohesion. How is this concept of social cohesion different from social capital? Like people who have really spent a lot of time thinking about this. And so the idea was to just read a lot about how this is measured or how people have thought about measuring this and then using the best available from the sociological literature, the currently most agreed upon means for measuring this. But yeah, I think the questions were how much do you trust your neighbors? Is your neighborhood close knit? How many of your neighbors do you know? And would you be willing to help your neighbors? So, yeah, I think your question was like more about my experience. Do I feel like those are the constituent components of social cohesion? I mean, I think there's some truth to that. They kind of measure slightly different things, but they're all related to the ways that you interact with your neighbors and sort of how you feel about that relationship. And of course, being more willing to help them indicates a higher level of cohesion, at least related to specifically helping. Because you might be willing to help, but not trust. I don't know. So
Yeah.
slightly different.
It's definitely a conversation we have in our household because we are huge city files, urbanites. So whenever we're looking to move to a new city, which we recently did, I'm moving to San Diego, we were looking for walkable neighborhoods that had high density, but not too high, like medium density, I would say. um, diversity of uses, and transit connections. And I think your paper actually looks at all of those. And,
Mhm.
since we recently moved here 2 months ago, I'm trying to think, okay, despite what your findings say, which we'll talk about in a minute, how long should it be until I find social cohesion in the place that I'm in? That's sort of what I'm looking for, which in part it is because we moved to a new city where we don't know very many people and we've picked this urban form to facilitate that. And you moved around a lot too. So are you picking places that sort of speak to the characteristics that you're studying, or just more about like your own personal experience between like how soon do you find social cohesion when you move to a new place that exemplifies these things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are lots of different factors that go into like both how I choose a place to live and how others choose a place to live. I don't think I'm thinking too much about social cohesion when I'm trying to pick a place to live. I think there are some other factors that are more like the drivers for the location. So yeah, like for me, connectedness to transit and like diversity of land use are super important because I like not owning a car and like to be able to go about my daily activities without a car or at least really good transit near me is like super important. I think what's interesting is, I like maybe this question of social cohesion is less about, for me at least, like something that I really think about in terms of like, okay, I'm going to choose apartment A or apartment B or neighborhood A or neighborhood B. And I think neighborhood A is going to have better social cohesion because of these reasons. But I think it's more about the two different places might create different opportunities to like interact with neighbors just by the way that they're designed. And I don't know that it's something that I personally think about too much when I'm finding a place to live, despite the fact that I wrote a whole paper about it.
I think that's fair. In some ways, it's nice to sort of separate yourself from the work that you're performing, but at the same time, I couldn't help think about my recent situation and how we selected a neighborhood. And, I've even been reading a lot of stuff about third spaces. Like, where do we find places where social interaction is easier? And
Mhm.
does it actually come down to density, difference of land uses, transit connectedness, walkability, or is it actually having a specific type of land use that facilitates social interaction? And so as you're going through this work, maybe you can speak through, you know, that specific component just because I've been reading a lot of the third spaces, not the work and not home, but really this in between space, like a coffee shop or a park. And in Europe, I find that there's a lot more of that where people are congregating in public spaces to meet up. Whereas in the US, for a lot of different reasons, there's not as many of these spaces for people to build social cohesion in more dense areas.
Yeah, I think that's probably true to some extent that these third spaces can be facilitators of more interactions between people who live in a place. We didn't explicitly look at third places as a category in this study.
Yeah.
We kind of lumped it in with this idea of diversity of land use, which definitely includes it, right? So if you have more diversity of land use, there are different categories. So there's residential, there's commercial, but then there's restaurants and shops and public spaces like libraries potentially. And so it's all kind of like grouped together. And the idea is that as if you have, for example, if you had more of those third places, then the diversity of land uses would increase. And so it's kind of lumped in with that metric. But I think there are potentially other factors as well besides just the existence of different types of spaces. So it's also about kind of how the neighborhood is organized spatially.
Yeah.
So what does the walking network look like or any kind of mobility network? How do you move around? And how well connected are these different places? Because you could have lots of different types of places, but if it's hard to get between them, then maybe they're less utilized or something like this. So the question was that we were thinking about is like, look at all the different aspects of neighborhood design that people have thought relate to walkability and accessibility.
Mhm.
And yeah, that's definitely like a big one, this existence of these third places.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that seemed to be the one positive finding in the study was that mixed use land use diversity was positively associated with cohesion, whereas the other aspects were not significantly or even strongly positively associated with cohesion.
So what we did was we looked at 4 aspects of walkable urban design and then looked at the uh, association between those metrics and this self-reported neighborhood social cohesion metric. And yes, diversity of land use was positively correlated with cohesion. The other 3 were actually they had a negative correlation, although the effects weren't as strong. That was, I think, a little bit more difficult to interpret off the bat when I saw this, but if you actually look more closely at the data and the relationships, I think that there are some nonlinearities that are driving this relationship. So the big thing is density. So there were 2 indicators associated with density. One was physical density and one was social density. So physical density is about physically how dense are the infrastructures, like the buildings and the street networks. Social density is like how many people are living there and working there. And both of those had a negative relationship. We looked at physical density out of curiosity, and what we found was that actually for most densities, it's a pretty level. There's not much of a relationship between density and social cohesion, but it's the really, really dense places that seem to have less social cohesion. In other words, the really high density places, like the centers of cities, it seemed that these places had less social cohesion, which was driving this overall trend that we found. And I don't know. I mean, there could be many different ways to interpret this. So now it's speculation, right? We don't have a like scientific reason to explain what we're seeing at the moment, or we don't have data that tells us exactly why we're seeing that. For example, I'm from Chicago, which if you've spent time in like the Loop, downtown Chicago, you know that it's a really dense place. If you live in that area, I could see living there amongst all the skyscrapers. It might be a little bit more difficult to form a tight social network with your neighbors as compared to a place that has a little bit less density. It could still be a really walkable neighborhood in
Mhm.
Chicago that is relatively high density and you could walk to the grocery store and all these places, but it's not quite as overwhelming as like a bunch of skyscrapers. So it could be, I don't know, this is my own personal speculation, but it could be that these like super dense areas can be hard places to form tight knit communities.
Yeah. Eh, a lot of downtown highly dense areas seem very transactional and transitory, where people are moving through and don't get clear connection to the place because they're there for a transaction. I'm there for business, I'm there for shopping, um, or I'm there for a sports game. And therefore, if you do live there, you're not as inclined to say hello to someone because you don't know if they are from that same area. That's sort of what's pulled us away from highly dense areas, transitory. And we're looking to build more of a neighborhood feeling wherever we live, where like you do know your bartender, you do know the guy who owns the corner shop, and they know you because they're not seeing as many people all the time. Hmm.
Well, there were 2 theories we were looking at, which I wrote about in the paper. One is like this new urbanism approach to sustainable development, which is about mixed use, reasonably dense areas that can enable active mobility. The idea is that these types of areas would create more social cohesion. But what I called in the paper also a kind of a critique of pure urbanism, where researchers have argued that if a place urbanizes to a point where it's really quite dense, this could overwhelm the people that are experiencing the space because there's so much going on. And like I think what you talked about with there's like it's well, you mentioned this kind of transactive nature of experiencing that part of the city.
Mhm.
I think I don't know. I mean, it could be that these places could be overwhelming, I think is the point that I'm trying to make, which maybe goes in line with what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I think there's opportunity to potentially improve these spaces. And there's lots of new things going on in cities, especially after COVID. One of the things we saw when looking at the data was that these super dense places also didn't have as much diversity as potentially other parts of the city. So really highly dense areas they might be like all office buildings or like maybe some office and some residential, but not a lot of third places, for
Mhm.
example. And now, especially after COVID, with office occupancy rates falling in cities and staying at a level that's not quite what they were before COVID, there's potentially opportunity to kind of reimagine some of these central business districts. Like, what are these places that used to be mostly office? If that's not all being used, how do we kind of transform this space to be potentially more vibrant, more interesting, and less overwhelming, less transactional, as you said? I mean, there's different things you could do, and none of them are easy, but perhaps this could also, going along with our findings in the paper, perhaps there are opportunities to make these places more socially cohesive as well.
When you were taking a look at the data, you said that this relationship might not have been linear in the sense that,
Yeah.
higher density is more positive or more negative as opposed to it's vice versa. Were you actually able to graph something that looked like a curve or that looked like another type of correlation in which you could say, hey, optimum density for social cohesion is somewhere around here?
Yeah, I hesitate to make a statement like there is an optimum density for cohesion. But yes, I mean, if you look at most neighborhoods,
Mhm.
and like so, the bottom roughly 90% of density. So ignoring the top 10% most dense places, we're looking at everything below that. Then the
Mhm.
relationship between social cohesion and density was not so clear. It wasn't really being up or down too much. And then if you look at like the top 10%, then you see this downward tilt. So the negative relationship between cohesion and density is really being driven by these like super dense neighborhoods. So there's kind of this concave down trend that we saw in the
Yeah.
data.
And we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but the cities that were part of this study,
The cities were Baltimore, Boston, Los Angeles, Orlando, Phoenix, and the Twin Cities in Minnesota.
I was just thinking, under
Yeah.
what circumstances does social cohesion or walkability not mean the same thing to different people? One of my thoughts was different cultures have different personal space boundaries. And does density mean something differently to people who have wider personal bubble spaces than those who don't? Thinking like in Asian cultures, very tight personal bubbles. Like, does one person's individual density relate to the built form density? Like, can you look across different cultures or across different temporal contexts and say, this is what social cohesion means? So I was just like, extrapolating this research because I thought it was super interesting. And what could a next research question be from here?
Yeah.
I guess that like long foray is to ask, like, taking this information and the data, do you see that there's a logical follow-up paper that you would like to explore? Maybe you don't have the data for it yet. It's not publicly available. What types of questions were spurred from this paper?
Yeah. So one quick comment, do you want to answer your question, is that none of these effects is super, super strong, but we wouldn't expect it to be either. Right.
Mhm.
So there is some relationship between these indicators of walkability and social cohesion, but you wouldn't, at least I wouldn't expect the variation in walkability or the variation in diversity of land use to explain a lot of the variation in social cohesion. I would expect it to explain some of it and then to see what the relationships are. And the reason I say that is because social cohesion, as you said, is affected by many, many more things than just the design of our built environment. It's also affected by our cultures, by our families, by our individual experiences, right? So we can't expect the design of the built environment to be like the thing that's going to make you take a neighborhood from zero social cohesion to the most cohesive place in the world, right? That would be an unrealistic expectation. In terms of next steps, I think one of the limitations or choices that we made in doing this analysis was to look at the links between the design of the space and these social outcomes.
Mhm.
So this is, yeah, like design or urban form features. And then on the other hand, these outcomes like social cohesion. I think something that's missing in that analysis is something in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I would argue that the way that the built environment is designed is going to impact our behavior in some way, right? So if it's a really walkable place, then maybe I'm more likely to walk. If it's a really green place with lots of parks, maybe I'm more likely to spend time in parks. The design kind of impacts our behavior. And then probably our behavior may have some impact on these outcomes like social cohesion or health. And so something that I'd like to do and that we're starting to work on now in the lab is adding this kind of middle layer of actually the behavior of people and explicitly looking at this what I think is kind of a middle piece, which is, yeah, how does the design impact behavior, and then how does behavior impact certain outcomes?
Okay. I could see like some trip tracking for individuals throughout the day to sort of help answer that. Or like you're saying, there is that relationship between individuals and some control factor that you're adding in there too. Like how is an individual interacting
Yeah.
with the built form and not just their, their feelings, because there is that intermediate step somehow. That would be very cool.
And also just collecting different types of data. So from surveys, for example, asking people about their daily patterns of activity, like how do you get to the grocery store and things like this, so that you can see these different layers of effects. So, like I said, how does the design of the space impact the behavior? And
Mhm.
then once you have something about the behavior, then you can also think about certain outcomes that you'd want to analyze.
Well, I really enjoyed reading the paper. It made me think a lot about my own situation, which is why all these questions, or most of them, is coming from that place of how I personally think about living in a city and what it means to put yourself in a dense place where you are reliant on transit and walkability in a way that suburbanites and rural areas, you are very much not at that dense level where you are reliant on a vehicle to get where you need to go. So this has been fun.
Yeah, this paper was me starting a postdoc and realizing that I can do any kind of research that I want. And this is
Yeah.
something that I was really interested in and was kind of similarly spurred by my own thinking about like what it means to live in a city and how the city impacts our experiences.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Building Better Cities. I hope you found our conversation insightful. And if you'd like to learn more about the work we do at Building Better Cities, or if you have any questions about today's episode, don't hesitate to send me a message at kate@buildingbettercities.com. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Until then, let's keep building better cities together.